Welcome to the Archivist's Tales, the verified crime files. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe and like us. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones. Turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. A warning to our viewers. What you're about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. There are small towns, and then there is Parsons, Tennessee. A quiet breath held in the deep country where the highways narrow into winding roads flanked by thick, indifferent woodland. It's the kind of place where community is less a concept and more a practical fact, where a broken fence line is fixed without asking, and locking your doors feels like a betrayal of neighborly faith. Life here moves on a slow, predictable, deeply comforting current. In the spring of 2011, this town felt utterly invisible to the frantic, chaotic world outside, and that was exactly the point. Holly Bobo lived in the very center of that comfort. She was 20 years old, pursuing nursing at UT Martin, a pursuit that spoke volumes about her nature, practical, nurturing, and focused on healing. She was the bright, immediate future of her family, a girl whose presence was a warmth in the house. Her life was defined by the rhythm of study, family dinners, and the easy laughter of a small-town girl with a large-scale dream. But that peaceful invisibility, that deeply held sense of security, was a fragile thing, built on the assumption that certain boundaries are simply never crossed. On the morning of April 13th, that assumption would be violently, irreversibly shattered, proving that even the quietest corners of the world can harbor the most primal, unbridled darkness. The sun rose that day over Decatur County, painting the sky with the same soft orange as always. Yet beneath it, a horror was already taking shape, a horror that would not only steal a life, but would also fundamentally corrupt the faith of an entire community. The morning began as a blur of routine: alarm clocks, coffee, the sound of Clint Bobo, Holly's younger brother, preparing for his day. It was still dark, the pre-dawn silence broken only by the mundane sounds of a household stirring. That routine, that precious sense of normalcy, detonated at 7:30 a.m. Clint was the last person to see her. He saw a figure, a man in camouflage, guiding Holly into the woods outside their home. In those first dizzying seconds, the human brain performs a desperate calculus, trying to reconcile the impossible image with the known world. Clint's initial thought, a terrifying self-deception born of panic, was that it must have been Holly's boyfriend playing some kind of ill-advised trick. But the movements were too controlled, the silhouette too menacing. It took only a beat, a fraction of a heartbeat, for confusion to snap into raw, paralyzing dread. The moment Clint picked up the phone to call 911, the fate of Holly Bobo shifted from a theoretical fear to a cold, hard fact. The primal panic in his voice, now preserved in official records, is the sound of innocence being destroyed in real time. Investigators would later dissect every syllable of that initial chaotic report, searching for a precision that trauma does not allow. Was the man's posture aggressive? Was Holly struggling? Every tiny detail became a 1,000-pound weight. In those agonizing first hours, a small-town police force, utterly unprepared for a crime of this magnitude, began the process of losing precious time,
failing to seal the scene, failing to grasp the gravity of the seconds ticking away. The abduction wasn't just a crime against Holly. It was a psychological attack on the Bobo family, forcing them to live inside the last horrific image that Clint would carry for the rest of his life. The 911 call didn't just summon the local sheriff. It sounded a deafening alarm across the entire state of Tennessee. What followed was a mobilization of resources on a scale Parsons had never conceived of, a desperate all-hands-on-deck effort that included the TBI, the FBI, the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, or TEMA, and an army of volunteers. Within days, the sleepy rural county became the epicenter of a national search. Tens of thousands of acres of unforgiving landscape, dense woods, thickets, swampy creek beds, and abandoned logging trails were divided into impossible grids. This wasn't a search. It was a grueling physical test of human endurance and hope. Every inch of ground had to be covered, every pond dragged, every abandoned structure peered into. The sheer scope of the task was a psychological weapon, wearing down the dedicated investigators. They weren't just looking for a missing person, they were battling the indifference of the wilderness itself, a landscape that seemed to actively conspire to hide its secrets. In the first weeks, the energy was frantic, driven by the belief that Holly was still alive and nearby. The TBI agents, usually accustomed to methodical, insulated work, were suddenly thrust into the raw, exhausting heat of a massive public crisis. They faced not just the terrain, but the crushing weight of the community's collective gaze, their every move scrutinized by people whose hope rested entirely on the professionals' shoulders. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth, and the unspoken fear that they were already too late. The psychological toll on the lead investigators was compounded by the relentless, often cruel cycle of false leads. In a case this high-profile, tips poured in by the thousands, over 5,000 pieces of information that had to be documented, verified, and pursued. Each call, each purported sighting, each anonymous scribbled note was a spark of electric hope. A detective might spend an entire night chasing a blurry surveillance photo from a convenience store 100 miles away, only to realize the figure was just a lost hiker. This wasn't simple administrative fatigue, it was a deeply corrosive process. The investigators were forced to invest their finite emotional capacity into narratives that repeatedly collapsed, leaving behind only the residue of failure. They had to maintain the facade of professionalism and controlled optimism for the Bobo family, knowing internally that the promising leads were evaporating faster than the morning dew. This relentless pursuit of phantoms became a defining feature of the cold case. Every time a new search area was identified, the entire community would hold its breath, only to exhale in a defeated sigh. The officers were operating in a constant state of agonizing dissonance, ethically bound to follow every thread, yet psychologically battered by the knowledge that most of those threads led nowhere, pushing the investigation further into a desperate silent void.
The inevitable eventually happened. The search exhausted itself. The national media moved on, the volunteer army disbanded, and the case of Holly Bobo transitioned from a desperate, high-tempo crisis to the terrifying permanence of a cold case file. The sheer longevity of the investigation became its own psychological obstacle. Holly's image, her smiling face once plastered on every telephone pole and milk carton, began to feel less like a person and more like a ghost, a perpetual reminder of an unresolved tragedy.
For the Bobo family, the passing of time was a public and private agony. Every anniversary of her disappearance, every untouched birthday, marked the impossible act of living a life while a vital piece of their existence was suspended in unknown darkness. The investigators shared this unique burden. They had to keep the case alive, breathing energy and resources into it long after the easy leads had dried up. They were haunted by the ritualized grief of the family, knowing that their failure to find Holly meant the Bobos could never fully begin the process of healing. The cold case became an anchor, tethering them to the constant awareness that a dangerous predator was still walking free in the very communities they were sworn to protect. In the early 2010s, the role of digital forensics was rapidly expanding, and investigators placed immense hope in Holly's digital life. The painstaking process involved a deep dive into her phone records, computer hard drives, and social media activity. Detectives searched for any sign of a secret correspondence, a planned rendezvous gone wrong, or a trace of digital communication with an unknown party. They were performing a form of digital archaeology, attempting to reconstruct the last moments of her life through data points. The tragic realization, however, was that the digital trail was largely cold. Holly's online life was consistent with her known persona, focused, normal, and non-controversial. This lack of a digital breadcrumb was profoundly frustrating. It negated the quick closure technology often promises. It forced the investigation back into the messy, unreliable world of physical evidence, human testimony, and the cold, dense silence of the Tennessee woods. The digital silence underscored the brutality of the abduction. It was swift, surgical, and left no modern trace, confirming the sickening thought that the attack was likely premeditated and executed with a chilling lack of error. With the physical evidence scarce and the digital trail erased, the investigation was forced heavily to rely on behavioral analysis and criminal profiling. They had only the initial, shaky testimony of Clint Bobo to build a framework, a man concealed by camouflage operating in the early morning hours in a remote area. The profile pointed toward a local predator, someone familiar with the terrain and confident enough to act on the doorstep of a family home. For the detectives, this realization was deeply unsettling. The suspect wasn't a distant stranger, but someone they might have passed on the street, someone who lived in the shadow of their ongoing search. They had to construct a mental image of a man whose cruelty was so immense that it allowed him to operate with brutal efficiency. This chapter of the investigation was defined by the relentless, quiet work of surveillance and deep background checks, forcing investigators to look at every person of interest with a profound and corrosive suspicion. This constant scrutiny and the necessary cynicism eroded the investigators' basic human trust, a key element of the professional trauma that would eventually lead them to seek help. The pressure mounted as the realization sank in. The community was not a victim, but a holding pen. The predator was among them. This sparked an era of silent surveillance, a subtle, often unseen operation designed to monitor known local suspects and track shifts in behavior under the stress of an ongoing investigation. In small, close-knit towns, this process is particularly agonizing. Neighbors began to look at neighbors with suspicion. Long-held friendships frayed under the weight of unsolved terror. The investigators were caught between their duty to find a killer and the damage their presence was doing to the social fabric of Parsons. They were listening, watching, waiting for a slip of the tongue, a nervous gesture, a sudden change in routine. This high-tension, low-action surveillance work demands intense psychological control, forcing detectives to carry the knowledge of what happened to Holly while remaining emotionally inert. The feeling of the monster being inches away, yet constantly out of sight, became the psychological torture chamber of the entire investigative unit. After 3.5 years of agonizing silence and fruitless searching, the break arrived not through forensic brilliance or detective work, but through chance. In September 2014, in a remote, heavily wooded area of Benton County, a significant distance from Holly's home, hunters stumbled upon remains. There is a terrible, immediate certainty that descends upon veteran investigators at such a scene. The sight, the isolation, the profound disrespect shown to the human body, it cancels all doubt. This was not just a body, it was likely Holly. The emotional dichotomy of that moment is immense. The gut-wrenching confirmation of a family's worst fear is simultaneously the first tangible evidence that can finally move the case forward. The crime scene immediately became a meticulous, sacred space. Forensic anthropologists and TBI agents worked to gather every single piece of evidence from the site, navigating the grim reality of skeletal remains and the environmental contamination that had occurred over years. Discovery provided a horrifying form of closure, ending the cruel suspense of the missing person narrative, only to replace it with the brutal, concrete reality of homicide.
The confirmation from forensic analysis was precise and horrifying. The remains belonged to Holly Bobo, and the cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. This finding transformed the case instantly. It wasn't a kidnapping that went wrong, it was an execution. The psychological impact on the investigators was crushing. All the years of hoping Holly might be found alive were violently erased. They had closure, yes, but it was purchased at the price of confronting the final, brutal truth of the killer's cold efficiency. The forensic evidence was limited due to the long exposure to the elements, but the location and method of death offered new, critical spatial clues about the perpetrator's familiarity with the remote area and the cold-blooded nature of the crime. The public focus immediately shifted from finding Holly to prosecuting her killer. The political and community pressure intensified, demanding justice for a young woman whose life was stolen by a predator who had evaded them for 1,250 days. The detectives, physically and emotionally drained, now faced the most critical phase of their career, building a case for a murder trial with the weakest possible evidence. The case eventually led investigators to Zachary Adams, a local man with a history of minor criminal activity. The path to Adams was murky, often involving third-hand information and local gossip, but the pressure to deliver a suspect was immense. The investigation zeroed in on the Adams family, and soon, Zachary's brother, Dylan Adams, entered the fray. What followed was a complex, volatile legal period dominated by questionable confessions and retracted statements. Dylan provided details about the crime, suggesting he and Adams were involved, but his testimony was riddled with inconsistencies, making him an unreliable narrator from the outset. Investigators found themselves navigating a moral and legal tightrope. They had testimony that placed Holly with the Adams brothers, but the sources were deeply flawed, possibly coerced, and certainly self-serving. This legal maze introduced the first major crack in the public's confidence, forcing the prosecution to contend with the fact that their key witnesses were criminals whose truthfulness was highly suspect. The prosecution's pursuit of a conviction against Zachary Adams hinged on a morally agonizing decision involving a third man, Jason Autry. Autry, a known associate of Adams and facing his own unrelated legal issues, claimed to have been present after the murder and helped move Holly's body. The evidence against Zachary Adams was largely circumstantial, and prosecutors realized that securing a conviction would be impossible without an eyewitness account. This led to the ultimate, necessary compromise. Autry was offered full prosecutorial immunity in exchange for his testimony. This is the moment the moral integrity of the case became deeply strained. A man who admitted to being an accomplice to the desecration of a body and later confessed to being present during the killing was allowed to walk free to secure the conviction of the primary suspect. For the detectives, this felt like a painful, necessary evil
the only path to delivering some form of justice to the Bobo family, even if it meant sacrificing the principle of prosecuting all involved parties. It was a compromise that weighed heavily on the conscience of every person involved in the case. Jason Autry became the central, most critical figure in the trial. His testimony provided the spine of the state's case against Zachary Adams, offering a chilling, step-by-step account of the crime's aftermath. Autry claimed that he and Adams went to a bridge where Adams displayed Holly's body and later described the process of transporting the remains to the remote site where they were eventually discovered. The state relied on the specific, verifiable details Autry provided, details about the route, the locations, and the logistics of the disposal, which were largely corroborated by cell phone data and geographical analysis. Filtered through the perspective of a self-admitted criminal, Autry's testimony was the only window into the horrific events, painting a dark portrait of Adams's calculated cruelty. However, the narrative was delivered under the cloud of his immunity deal, meaning every word was tainted by his clear motive for self-preservation. For the jury and the public, it was an unearning choice. Accept the word of a man who confessed to enabling the crime, or risk allowing the primary killer to walk free due to insufficient forensic evidence. The defense naturally launched a relentless and withering attack on Jason Autry's character. His criminal history, his shifting stories, and the immense prize of his freedom were meticulously bettered for the jury. He was accused of fabricating the story whole cloth to escape his own incarceration. For the prosecutors, the trial became a precarious act of constant damage control, defending the integrity of a witness who fundamentally lacked any. The detectives, who had worked tirelessly for years, had to sit and watch as their entire case rested on the shaky pedestal of a tainted source. This phase of the case was a psychological crucible for everyone. Autry, under the pressure to perform, the defense trying to dismantle him, and the investigators, deeply invested in a conviction yet morally wrestling with the means to achieve it. It highlighted the ugly truth that justice, especially in cases without clean forensic evidence, is often an imperfect, compromised construct built from desperation and legal maneuverings, forever leaving the shadow of a complete truth just out of reach. The defense for Zachary Adams centered its strategy on the simple yet powerful concept of reasonable doubt. They aggressively exploited the two most glaring weaknesses in the prosecution's case: the near total absence of direct forensic evidence linking Adams to Holly Bobo's abduction or murder, and the profound unreliability of the state's star witness, Jason Autry. The defense painted Autry not as a truth teller, but a manipulative opportunist who masterfully crafted a narrative, possibly based on media accounts and information gleaned from other suspects, to secure his immunity. They argued that the timeline was thin, the physical evidence circumstantial, and the entire prosecution was a rush to judgment fueled by public pressure and the desire to close a high-profile case. They asked the jury to look beyond the emotional outrage and focus on the fundamental constitutional promise: proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial ultimately presented a terrifying philosophical quandary to the jury. How can one arrive at a certainty when the only voices speaking about the crime's inner workings are those of admitted criminals? This chapter of the story emphasizes the moral ambiguity inherent in such a verdict. Even as evidence of Zachary Adams' possible involvement mounted, the defense successfully chipped away at the possibility of absolute certainty. They introduced the specter of a compromised, unfair investigation, forcing the community to confront the uncomfortable idea that justice in this case might be a trade-off. For the investigators watching from the back rows, it was a painful lesson in the limitations of their profession. They knew in their hearts they had the right man, but their ability to prove it rested on the testimony of the very kind of person they spent their career putting away. The weight of this uncertainty, the knowledge that a single questionable witness could sway the fate of a killer, was a profound source of distress, demonstrating how the justice system itself can wound those who serve it. The culmination of the 2017 trial was an emotional pressure cooker. Days of deliberation stretched into agonizing silence, forcing the Bobo family to relive the trauma in slow motion. When the jury finally returned, the air in the courtroom became physically heavy. The moment the verdict was read was not a moment of pure relief, but of devastating, conclusive finality. For the Bobos, it was the end of a 6-year fight for accountability, a moment where the man who stole their daughter was named and judged. But the justice was imperfect. It was a victory purchased with legal compromise and years of debilitating grief. This segment focuses on the Bobo family's profound, irreversible loss. The verdict gave them a name, but it could never return their daughter, nor could it erase the images and the testimony that now permanently resided in their minds. The public closure offered by the court was merely a superficial bandage over an incurable family wound. The aftermath of the trial revealed the enduring, often unseen costs of such a tragedy. Holly's parents and her brother Clint were now forced to navigate a life forever marked by public mourning and the specter of the crime. They became reluctant symbols of loss and resilience, forever tethered to the trauma that consumed their quiet town. This goes beyond standard grief. It's a specific, public form of suffering that demands a strength few possess. The story of the Bobo family after the verdict is one of quiet, determined survival, the struggle to honor Holly's memory without being consumed entirely by the horror of her death. Their endurance, however,
came at a heavy cost, a lifetime of living with the knowledge of how their daughter's life ended, a knowledge delivered by the very courts that were meant to protect them. Their story acts as a profound moral undertone, reminding viewers that a successful prosecution does not equate to a successful recovery for the victim's loved ones. The enduring legacy of Holly's case transcended the courtroom. The massive, initially disorganized search effort spurred significant, necessary legislative change. In 2014, the state of Tennessee passed the Holly-Bobo Act, or a similar related reforms, designed to streamline communication and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, local, TBI, and TAMA during large-scale missing persons searches. This act was a tangible, positive outcome born from the tragedy, ensuring that the investigative inefficiencies and delays experienced in 2011 would not be repeated. The Bobo family's quiet advocacy, alongside the painful lessons learned by the TBI, helped to create a faster, more integrated response system. This reform, while a source of pride, is a somber monument, a reminder that such improvements are only forged in the crucible of extreme failure and loss. It is a subtle philosophical point. True progress often requires a shocking human sacrifice to illuminate systemic flaws. The full title of this documentary, and the central premise of the investigator's trauma, is not limited to Holly Bobo. The case, while career-defining, was the psychological breaking point in a series of horrific encounters. Briefly, this chapter introduces the context of two other unnamed cases that preceded or coincided with the Bobo investigation. Cases that involved similar levels of depravity or sustained difficult psychological involvement. The details of these prior cases are deliberately kept minimal and non-graphic. The focus is solely on the cumulative effect. The detectives arrived at the Bobo investigation already carrying the invisible scars of other family suffering, other violent deaths, and other confrontations with utter human cruelty.
Holly's case, with its years of crushing public pressure, its eventual brutal resolution, and its legal compromises, was simply the final, unbearable weight that tipped the scales, pushing men and women who thought they were immune to the trauma past their capacity to cope. This segment uses a cinematic, vivid tone to describe the quiet, desperate internal retreat of the men and women whose dedication to justice cost them their own peace. The final, and perhaps most courageous act of the entire investigation took place not in a courtroom or a wooded search area, but in the quiet, sterile room of a therapist's office. For decades, seeking psychological help in law enforcement was viewed as a profound weakness, a career-limiting move. But the Bobo case, with its protracted duration, its public pressure, and its ultimate violent resolution, finally broke through that barrier of stoicism. This chapter focuses on the lead detective's slow, painful realization that they could no longer carry the weight of the waiting alone. The decision to seek help was not a failure of duty. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation and, paradoxically, professional integrity. By acknowledging their human limits, they were ensuring they could continue to serve, preventing the ghosts of the past, Holly Bobo and the others, from destroying their future. It was the moment they traded the badge of emotional invulnerability for the fragile, necessary shield of humanity. The justice system delivered a conviction against Zachary Adams, but the story's true moral resolution lies in the courage of the detectives who chose to heal. They learned that confronting human evil is a profession that requires a psychological exit strategy. The narrative loop closes on the concept that service to justice must include justice for the servant. The quiet acknowledgement of trauma is the new, unsung front line of law enforcement, a recognition that the true cost of solving a case like Holly Bobo's is measured not just in dollars or years, but in the enduring toll on the souls of the people who were forced to confront the unimaginable. The final image lingers on the idea of resilience, a professional hardened by years of darkness choosing the light of recovery, proving that even after the deepest immersion in human depravity, there is a path back to being human.